Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. Thank you for, I feel very short here. Thank you for having me. It's my first time in Slovenia, and I'm very excited to visit Ljubljana, beautiful city. So I'm Elena Martellozzo. I'm an associate director of a Center for Abuse and Trauma Study in London at Middlesex University. And in the center, we do a number of different projects that relate to research around child sexual abuse online, online grooming, and all sorts of online harms that may really happen online and harm children and young people. But primarily what we do, and I believe this is why I'm here today, we work very, very closely with the police. I myself I'm the director of programs for a degree apprenticeship for 3 police forces in the UK. Just out of curiosity, in the United Kingdom, every police officer that starts this career does a criminology degree. So what we do, we teach and engage with police officers as part of our job. So we bring research that we carry out to the classroom. And it's a pleasure to share with you today some of the work that we do at the center. So, today's session, I'm going to talk a little bit about living in a digital age, because we all do. Not just our offenders, but also how you police. These days, it's no more just policing on the streets. Everything is interconnected with technology. And the way we live is through often a lens of a mobile phone or a screen. So it's important to bear that in mind from a sociological perspective. I'm going to talk to you about vulnerabilities, because it's wonderful to live online, but there are issues related to vulnerabilities. So I'm going to talk to you about the exposure to harmful people, i.e., groomers, offenders of all sorts, but also exposure to harmful content. And I understand that in the audience today, aside of police officers, we also have teachers, educators, people working with young people. So this is very important, because it's important to understand how young people can be affected by some of this content. So in terms of content, I've done a large study in the kingdom looking at how online pornography can influence the behavior of young people and can harm young people. So I'm quite pleased to share with you some of the findings and some recommendations for change, which I hope you can take home and make it yours. Now, I love starting my presentations with a picture. This photo was taken during the coronation of the new king. I saw it in The Guardian, and I was like, this is just spectacular. You can see the difference between the pre-Z generations and us. There's no children there, all adults, all people our age, more or less. But one lady who's really living the experience through her eyes. So, why am I saying this to you? Because this really speaks volume. Speaks volumes in terms of how we live, how we behave, how we operate, and how we interact. And this is valid for both us as, citizens of the world, but as offenders and as victims. Often we think about, the wonderful things that, look at today. We have a full audience here, which is great to see, but also a lot of people watching us from home, because technology allows for all this. So it's all wonderful, but there's many buts, which, I don't need to tell you, because you experience them all. And these are the positives that I would always like to start with. I've worked in countries where, if you talk about the risks, they would say, oh, we need to ban this. I worked in the Middle East for a long time. And over there, they're very brutal. They can stop connection and connectivity from one day to another. And that's definitely something that we don't want. We need to appreciate all the positives that, the online connectivity allows us to experience. The first is obviously the social interaction, which, we take it for granted, but we didn't take it so much for granted during the pandemic, where without those devices, our lives would have been even more miserable and harder, particularly for children and young people who were digital by default. They were forced to be digital because they were forced to educate themselves through devices. So there's a lot of healthy experiences. Also in terms of sexual learning and exploration. A lot of children are looking for identities. I don't know about here in Slovenia, but in the UK, we're going through a lot of changes with gender diversity, sexuality, and a lot of this is allowed because of the connectivity online. Online mental health support. I was speaking to Emily, who you hear later this morning, that a lot of the support, the mental health support that is given, that is provided, is through online connections. Educational resources, communications with friends, family, farewell, self-development as well. How many times, we go online to search for something, for a piece of information which wasn't possible a while ago. And all the positives as well for the law enforcement. I'd love to have a conversation with you later if possible, but I would love you to listen. This is what I ask my officers. Tell me the positives of online connectivity for your job in terms of, what it allows you to do better because of the connections that you have. I'm sure the list is endless. But, and as a criminologist, I always bring the bad things to the table, even if I start very positively. There are a lot of issues that we've experienced, that we've studied, that you are working with. The first one is grooming, which is one of the focus of today's talk. Coercion, exploitation, which has exacerbated and immensely increased because of this online connectivity. But why is that happened? And it's a long quote, which I think really contains the juice of really what online connectivity means for groomers, sex offenders. And I always say that online sex offending has always existed. What we see more is the facilitation with which it happens, so the speed with which it happens. But it doesn't mean that we have perhaps more crimes happening, we just have more opportunities. Because the internet is the facilitator of this. I wonder at times, and this is some of the challenges that I present to our officers, how many of the people that you arrest, that you catch, either conversing or exchanging an image, are real offenders, or if they're just opportunistic offenders, because they found themselves in the opportunity to do it and they grasp it, because they take risk. And let me tell you a little bit more theoretically what that means. But let's go back to this quote. Here it says that cyberspace through the internet has provided new and covert pathways for sex offenders to express their attraction to children. So it has allowed sex offenders to finally find their habitat, their connectivity with other people. If you think back maybe 30 years ago, an offender, a sexual offender, a pedophile, if you like, if you want to use this term, was a very lonely figure, would operate on his own, would find a way to get close to those near a child, to groom those as well. would find a child, would find the way of getting close to the child, gain that trust before the abuse takes place. This has expedite the way in which this happens. Additionally, it's been asserted that offenders may be increasingly move online given the increasingly restrictory real-world access to children. So we talked about, the accessibility, and accessibility is key. Children are more online because they have to be online. Whether we stop them or not, they have to be online. I blocked my son from being online too much, and often I get requests from the school saying, you need to stop blocking him because we need him to be online. And of course, we had to review the amount of time that children are online, but they are online, so there are vulnerabilities there available to everyone. And the anonymity offered through the internet and related technological instruments has motivated and provided confidence to particular offenders in searching for images to satisfy their criminogenic needs. Lots of words there to say what? To say that what the internet does, that the real world doesn't do, provides that layer of anonymity, and that layer of confidence, and that layer of wanting to take a little bit of more risk. Now, think about it. And we do it all the time as well. I find that people, when they write, for example, a simple emails, they're more straightforward and sometimes heavier with what they want to say, with their words, than they would ever be if they were facing that person face to face. In England, we say the tone of your email is very strong. Now, emails don't have a tone, but you see what I mean. Because of that kind of lack of presence in front of you, you're a little bit more forceful in that WhatsApp text. You're a little bit stronger in that email that you send because you feel a little bit more confident. And there's that kind of detachment and distance. And all those theories are not theory. They're applicable to what and how offenders behave and young people behave as well. Because remember, children love risk. We all love risk. We take less risks now because we're more aware of the consequences. But as children, we didn't. I used to love riding motorbikes. Now I'm terrified. Because I'm more aware that I could hurt myself. I loved skiing off-piste. Now I don't do it anymore. You're more aware, you're more conscious. Children do not, mainly because their front cortex is not yet developed to be able to make those informed decisions. Simple as that. Now, I've just referred to a very important theory here by John Sula, a psychologist from the US, who talks about the behavioral disinhibition. So let me tell you a little bit about it. I don't want to give you a big lecture on this, but just to make you realize and to apply this knowledge also in the work that you do. So we talked about the element of anonymity. So, the fact that we are anonymous gives us even more disinhibition. Desensitization. Because we're not facing a problem, because we're not looking at someone in the eye, because the person is not near us, we are more detached and therefore more desensitized. We're invisible, meaning that, you could be whoever you want to be. You can have 50 email addresses or 30 Instagram accounts, etc., and still have a heavy presence online. You are free from any social constraints. You have nobody tell you, don't run too fast, stop talking so loudly, don't say that word. You just do it. So that level of kind of isolation, freedom, detachment from norms and rules of society, and social norms, religious norms, they're all gone, out the window. So we can do whatever we want. And all these impact how we behave online. And I use this all the time to explain both how children behave online and how offenders respond to children's behavior. Because I'm sure you get it all the time when you, now I'm assuming you work closely with offenders, or some of you, so apologies for assuming. But having spoken to some of you, I know that you're very close to offenders. So you work very closely with them, and a lot of them, I'm sure, and this is what happened to me when I was interviewing sex offenders, they would say, I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to do anything. That kind of, creating excuses because I was only online. It didn't seem real. I didn't think it was true. I was just fantasizing. These are all the kind of long list of excuses that we get. And it's all because of this sense of freedom that Suler explains really well. Now, this helps us as well on the next slide here to understand what types of offenders do we usually deal with. So a study was conducted back in 2012 by a group of colleagues of mine who did an in-depth international study with a number of different countries on different types of online offenders. And they came up with an interesting typology, which I believe is still applicable in today's world. So you have different types of offenders, okay? As you know, there's a difference, for example, between a sex offender and a pedophile, right? I hope you appreciate the difference. Not all pedophiles offend, and not all sex offenders are pedophile, just to be clear. So there are offenders who are intimacy-seeking offenders, okay? Who are just there for seeking for a little bit of fun, shall we say. They have no previous convictions. They work in isolation, so there's no contacts with other offenders. And they're very unlikely to have any, forgive the term child pornography, it's not a term that we use in England, but I know that at European level it's preferred. They don't have any indecent images of children, of child sexual abuse images, we call them CSAM. They're likely to engage in intimate relationships with a child, and they're likely to believe that the child is consenting to the relationship. So this is a person that is looking for a relationship, okay? So we have those type of offenders, but we also have those are more adaptable offenders. So those that perhaps are not looking for one relationship, but are looking for many relationships. And they're looking for anyone that would agree to converse and engage in a sexual or intimate relationship online with the offender. And these people seem to be people who have previous convictions, people who view young people or children as capable of making decisions to consent. And I hope that we all agree here that children are children, and children are not allowed to consent to any adult sexual intimacy. They do engage in a great deal of networking, so they're constantly online seeking for opportunities, and they adapt their grooming tactics depending on who they have in front. So if the child behaves in a certain way, they modify their behavior. So they are adaptable for this reason. And then the third type is the hypersexualized offender, who has a significant collection of indecent images of children, who has a wide network of offenders with whom they interact. They use deception. They're more likely to be aggressive in their contact behavior and more direct. And they're likely as well to take their online contact offline to then carry out the abuse. So the offense doesn't stay online. So we have identified these three types of offenders, I should say, which of course lead to all sorts of victimization, as you can imagine. And what's interesting here is that all the theory that I talked to you about before, you know, how it used to be 30, 40 years ago, pre-internet, whereby an offender had to go through a number of different phases. Now imagine, you know, if a man or a woman is interested in offending, the first thing that they need is accessibility to that child. So first of all, they need to get access to their child to be able to start creating a friendship, okay? So there's that kind of friendship forming phase, which then moves into more of a relationship forming phase. And then there's a risk assessment forming phase. What does that mean, risk assessment? Is when the offender establishes that there are no risk to him in terms of getting caught. So, you know, you need to remove that child from that kind of public space to be able to be more isolated. But that's only possible when the child feels comfortable, when the child has been groomed successfully to therefore move into a more kind of intimate space. Because children are intelligent. Children know right from wrong, most children. But they only agree to this kind of behavior when they believe that there is a real relationship. So that's when the grooming has been successful. After the risk assessment phase, there is an exclusivity phase. What does that mean? That's when the offender starts talking to the child in a way of, you know, you're the only person that I want, you're the only person that I love, you mean everything to me. So that's the child feeling important, valued, and feeling love. And that's one of the hardest things for us to appreciate, that children often love their offenders. And that's why we know so little about victimization, because it's very hard for a child to disclose. And when they realize that actually that was abuse, that wasn't real love, that's when the guilt factors comes in. They feel guilty, they feel responsible, they feel they've done something wrong, they feel bad. And that's when they don't want to speak to you anymore. I work very closely with an organization in Italy called Prometeo. And what they do, they help children who have been sexually abused. And it's a kind of a hotline, if you like, with not very much funding. But what they do is really extraordinary. They help victims from all around Italy to come forward if they need support. And the oldest victim is 90 years old. And that shows, you know, that that person who's been abused as a child has lived a whole life with this secret because of this sense of guilt and shame and feeling bad for having agreed to sexual intercourse when we know that children cannot agree, but they've been groomed. And that's when we have the sexual phase at the end. Now, this is what happens in this cycle of abuse, okay? When we talk about online abuse, sorry, I'm too close to the microphone, the whole process speeds up much quicker, okay? The whole kind of making feel the child reassured and the loving relationship, it's much faster. It doesn't necessarily mean that the grooming process doesn't take place. It's just much faster, and it happens online. And it happens not with one child, but with often, depending on what type of offenders, with a number of different victims. Okay, when I worked with online officers operating undercover, and when arrests were taking place, some offenders had a multiple number of online presences. They've had a numerous number of different identities, and they were targeting 10, 20 children at a time, because that's what they do if they are the third type of offender. So this happens also online, but in a much faster speed. So the identification of a young person happens very quickly. We know well that social platforms allow for anybody to be in, even if there's a kind of age of participation. We also know that building trust takes place much faster. We also know that developing secrecy still happens online because we have a number of victims that have come forward to tell us about their process of grooming and victimization. And perhaps what happens as well is instead of, that physical presence and that kind of online grooming process that leads to buying gifts, sending gifts to the address, and this happens, and I'm sure you've seen it, experienced as well in your job. And eventually, there's also a seeking to meet in the real world, although it's happening less and less and less, because offenders are aware of officers targeting offenders, and they also get the same level of gratification without risking to physically move. When I was working in this area with the police, I still work in the area, but a little bit less undercover now, there were a huge amount of people traveling to meet children. That number now is reduced dramatically because of the fear of being caught, the fear of being arrested. So the abuse remains online more and more, which makes it even harder for people like you to detect it and for victims to come forward. And I'd love to hear about your experience, because I'm talking from the UK perspective, but having spoken to many officers, I know that it's similar for most of it. So now let me talk to you about a case study which again goes back to the work that I did with Scotland Yard when I was working undercover. So what I did for them, this is a few years ago now, I was operating undercover with a number of detectives who were pretending to be either children, and I know this is something you don't do and you're not allowed to do, I believe, but let me tell you about this. They were working undercover pretending to be children or pretending to be offenders. And my role as a researcher was to study the process, to study the type of offending, to study the type of online victimization, the types of behavior that were happening at the time. So I looked at a number of cases. I looked at about 38 subjects who were then eventually arrested. And let me tell you about their modus operandi, because this is more about offenders' behavior. Half of the subjects that were arrested, they used other devices. So, of course, you start with the grooming process, but to ensure that the child is in your possession, you move on to different platforms. So often they would ask, I want to text you. I want to see you. So they would move on. At the time, webcamming was very common. The majority of offenders sent the young girl, who was actually a police officer, a huge amount of online pornography. Just to prepare, so this is the grooming process, you see, to prepare the child of sexual experiences, because children are not necessarily experts in sex. They probably don't even know what it is. They're just exploring. So sex offenders often were sharing pornography with the child just to show what could happen in their relationship. 2/3 of the subjects expose themselves online. So they would turn on their webcam and masturbate, thinking that they were, engaging with a young girl. So exposure, again, is one of the crimes that they commit, thinking that they're engaging with a young child. Now, I think this is important to kind of think about, because that's when often the relationship ends. And these are more kind of attention-seeking type of offenders who want to get physical satisfaction through perhaps an act of masturbation, and that's the end of it. And often they would just shut down the camera and move on. So they just wanted to have a kind of quick fix with the child, but they weren't interested in building a relationship with the child. They just wanted a little bit of like watching pornography, I presume. And that's how they treated the child, as a kind of their kick and their excitement for however long it takes. 2/3 turned up expecting to meet a child. So only a small amount of people would travel to meet that child because they were hoping for a physical relationship, for building a relationship physically with a child. And what was interesting about this is those that traveled to meet the child, they were obviously interviewed by myself and by the police, and most of them were claiming that it was just fantasy. They had no intention to develop a relationship with the child, although most of them turned up with lubricants, condoms, toys, so they were fully prepared for the relationship to take place. Now, who are these people? You know, because often when we used to think about sex offenders, you think of that kind of old man mainly, in a kind of, you know, coat, sitting in the park on his own, in a raincoat, right? That's the kind of image that you have? Well, no. What was interesting here, and the ages, by the way, have decreased, the majority of groomers of that particular study were white males, aged between 36 and 45. Now, maybe in a country like Slovenia, saying white males doesn't mean anything, but this study was carried out in London. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to London, but London is one of the most multicultural cities in Europe. So to say that the majority of groomers were white is really to say that it is often a white problem, a white male problem. The majority had their own children. So these were not, you know, geeky people living in a loft with their mother downstairs and, you know, texting and emails. These were men, often with families, in professional jobs. And it's interesting we say this because as a result of this study, there's been another study that it's called The Knock, and I will send you the link. And The Knock is a study that really supports secondary victims of these crimes. Because what we did many times, I mean, not myself, but the officers, and I was just observing them because I'm not a policewoman, what they did, they would go to these men's premises at, you know, you go very early. I don't know what you do here, but we go at like 5 o'clock in the morning to make sure that everybody's in bed. Knock at their door, that's why it's called The Knock, the study. Knock at their door and say, I'm looking for Mr. Smith. We found him with, you know, 2 million images and he's been grooming a child. Imagine what happens to that family around him. Because these are men, as I said, with families in professional jobs. And we know that once offenders of this type are arrested, they often try to commit suicide, self-harming, because, you know, the knock-on effect is huge, because the whole world collapses, right? Because what they were doing was thinking like Sula explained, you know, anonymity, freedom, risk-taking without thinking of the consequences. So the knock is that kind of support that is provided to victims around offenders. Because imagine the wife and the wives and the children who see their father being taken away because of this. So anyway, I'm diversing. But it's interesting to see every aspect of this crime. Half were married and in long-term relationships. Most of them had no criminal convictions. So one of the most challenging things about this type of crime is that you can't tell who the offender is. You know, if you think of drug crimes, if you think of theft, if you think of organized crime, you know, you can kind of delineate what type of offender you're looking for. With this, no idea. I've spoken from the truck driver to the lawyer committing this kind of crime. So it's very challenging also from a policing perspective. You know, developing a typology on this, it's challenging and a little bit risky and a little bit dangerous because they come from any walk of life. So the typology of these offenders has to be fluid. And we need to think, you know, in a kind of flexible way. The vast majority of offenders who were arrested because of traveling to meet a child had indecent images in their computer. So there are studies suggesting that, you know, offending online, indecent images viewing and the collection of indecent images may lead to contact abuse. And half of them were in possession of level 5. Well, this is more of a kind of an old term, and level 5 is now a level A, B, or C, it's translated. So A would be the severity of the image, which is bestiality, and B and C is less dangerous. So the majority were in possession of level A images. Now, so do online offenders cross over from offline offending? Well, we've talked about this a little bit. We talked about the exploring the opportunities in the virtual space. We talked about establishing that social connection. And this engages more and more with the virtual communities in the real world. And when this is not sufficient, when this is not enough, the abuser gains access to further connectivities to be able to create that opportunity. The opportunity make teeth, we say. Now, let me give you a few numbers. I don't know if you know the Internet Watch Foundation. It's that kind of watchdog that sits in the UK that kind of cleans online spaces from any abusive images. And they do a lot of research in this sphere. And they are arguing that almost 20,000 children between 7 and 10 who were sexually abused online in the first 6 months of this year were forced or manipulated into filming themselves. So, as you can see, the grooming doesn't necessarily lead to contact sexual abuse, but also other types of online harms. And we also found that online grooming crimes have gone up by 80% in 4 years. This was a study that was conducted by the NSPCC just recently. And between 2021 and 2022, there were 6,156 sexual communication with a child offences in the UK, which was an increase in the previous year. So it's still happening, it's still going on, and it's still very present. This was highlighted just yesterday in the BBC News as well, that grooming, sadly, is increasing. This kind of contact communication is increasing. Now, having looked at people online, and given that there are some educators amongst the audience, I think it's important to talk about also the content that some children may come across online. And I would like specifically to focus on pornography online. I don't know if it's a big issue here, but in the UK, it's been a reason for litigation for a few years. And I don't know if you heard of the online bill, but it's a very important piece of legislation which will push, you know, big companies that are making million of pounds, like Pornhub, OnlyFans, Google, to be responsible for their platforms and to be responsible for children who are visiting their platforms not to see this content. Because children have rights, right? They're allowed to go on Google, but they shouldn't be allowed to see things that they do not wish to see. So this is the argument. So the online bill is being very punitive to big organizations who do not clean their spaces properly. So I would like to share with you some of the evidence that we have put together. So again, going back of the Internet Watch Foundation report, that there's been an increase of more of 8,000 instances of children aged 7 and 10 who had shared nude images online. Now, we know that this is happening, okay? We know that children are connecting, children are feeling that they can develop their relationships online. People feel, as for the same reasons that Sulas really coherently was expressing, people feel more disinhibited. So as it happens to adults, and we have a lot of results on that as well, you know, there's a lot of online dating, and people within few clicks are more comfortable to share their bodies, their views. Children do the same. So we can't escape the fact that that's happening. But what can we do to support them? Since the first lockdown in the UK, and you know, we've all been through that, there's been an increase of 360% of self-generated abusive images. So the Internet Watch Foundation, as I explained to you, are responsible for removing any image that is damaging, okay? Any indecent image. A nude photo of a child is indecent because that child is underage. So if a child takes a photo of himself or herself naked and sends it to the boyfriend or girlfriend, and that picture then goes online somewhere, that forms an indecent image. So the Internet Watch Foundation has spent many years, I would say up until now, cleaning those images because these are indecent images of children. So there's been a 360% increase during the pandemic, which shows that it's happening. And children are exposing themselves to strangers. Now, the argument is here, you know, there could be a grooming process behind it, or it's just happening because children are, again, taking risks and feeling excited about this. But they must learn it from somewhere, or they might just want to test the waters, as we say a little bit. So, what are the concerns? The concerns are that, unfortunately, pornography is now the most prominent sexuality educator for many young people. Children want to learn about sex. Sex is interesting. And children, when they learn about it a little bit, they want to know more. They want to see the how and the what and the ifs. And sadly, this kind of education is given to them through viewing on pornography, which wasn't available when I was a child, but it is available now. Just with everybody can go on Pornhub. If you go, no, don't go now. But anybody, it's accessible. It's open to everyone. It's free. So you can watch porn at any moment of the day, if you wish. And if you mistype something, porn comes up. I don't know if it's ever happened to you, but it does. Most young people discover porn well before they even try sex. Even before giving a kiss, they've seen porn. So what do you think might happen? Well, we've had a number of cases in schools. We've had sexual assaults amongst just young children. We've had all sorts of things that has led us to believe that one of the many causes, and it's not the cause, I have to be clear, it's not the reason, but one of the many causes for some type of adolescent behavior is also through the eyes of pornography. Because the pornography that they see is not how we see sexual intercourse, but it's violent, it's misogynist, it's degrading, and it's painful. So that's how they see relationships. So let me tell you a little bit more. So the mainstream, sorry for the G, is out of place, of pornography. So a study that was conducted, this is not conducted by us, but this was conducted in Australia by our colleagues who are way ahead of us, unfortunately, or luckily, so we can learn a lot from them. They argue that 48% of girls who have seen porn, they've seen it by the age of 15. 3 of the top 10 most viewed websites are pornography websites. 3 of the most, more than, you know, cartoons or YouTubes or whatever, it's porn. 48% of the boys that have seen porn, they've seen it by the age of 13. So boys respond to, they access pornography earlier, and boys respond to pornography in a different way from girls. And 35% of scenes in popular porn contains non-consensual behavior. So again, it's not the type of porn that you might have seen. It's aggressive and it's not consensual. So it looks like rape taking place. Okay? And this is 35% of the content that exists. What did we find? So we conducted a study a couple of years ago with more than 1,500 children all across the UK. We went into schools and we spoke to children and young people about what they think about porn and how porn can affect them and their behavior. So we found this. As I said to you before, as our Australian colleagues have shown, there is a difference between how girls and boys respond to porn, okay? 56% of the boys who have seen porn, they feel positive about porn. And they're less likely to see online porn as exploitative or degrading. They think it's a bit fun, using their words. Girls don't think like this. 40% of the girls who have seen porn, they feel negative about it, and they're worried about how boys may want them to behave in a sexual relationship. And they behave as if they want to please the boys, because that's how they think they should behave. Because they're influenced by what porn has taught them. I'm getting there. There's also a difference between ages. So we weren't allowed to do the research with anyone younger than 11 for ethical reasons. Research is complicated. So we can only start at 11, but we know that children are exposed to pornography at the age as young as 8 or 7, sadly, okay? But from our sample, which was from 11 to 16, we found that of the 28% that have seen pornography, 21% want to copy it. So they want to emulate it. 39% of the 13 to 14-year-olds and 42% of the 15 to 16-year-old, they want to copy what they see. It's basically their teacher. So they learn about behavior in bed through the eyes of pornography. This is also interesting. Let me show you. So one of the questions that we asked the children was, how did you feel when you saw pornography for the first time? So the hard lines are the reaction during the first time that they saw pornography, and the lined lines are following a repeated viewing of pornography. What does that mean? That there's a difference. The first time you see something, I'm sure it's for everybody that it's shocking. Now imagine the first time, I don't know, I'm talking to police officers here, that you've seen a dead body, okay? The first time you see a dead body, it's like, it's hard, you know? But then you're used to seeing lots of dead bodies, okay? So by the time you see, 50 dead bodies, it's a body, okay? And the same with how we react to different things, the more we're exposed to it. So the first time that they saw pornography, they were curious, okay? But they were also shocked, confused, disgusted, and nervous. Look at the turn on. Turn on means excited, okay? It was very, very low because they were more preoccupied about, this is terrible. I'm really scared about this. This is, my kids would say, gross. That's the word that they use. Or yuck, that's another word. So they would feel a yucky feeling, right? They don't feel excited. But the more you're exposed to that, the feeling of disgust or, confused and shocked goes down, and you're more turned on. And when you reach that level of turned onness, if that's a word in English, you're seeking for harder and harder and harder pornography that becomes more and more and more different, sometimes violent. And that's a kind of a cycle that we also apply to sex offenders. When they look at one image of a child, they want more of that image, and the more younger, they look for a younger child, to the point that perhaps they want also that kind of content abuse. Now, I'm not comparing sex offenders to children, but I'm just describing this cycle, how the thinking process changes because of more exposure. So, that was a lot, wasn't it? There is a number of things that we can do, and I always like to kind of conclude, and I'm conscious of time. I only have 4 minutes left. We always think, what can we do to change this? You know, I do a lot of lobbying, campaigning. I do a lot of work with charities on how can we change this. And a lot of people argue it's about education. Yes, education is wonderful. You know, it's the weapon that really changes everything. I agree with that. And perhaps we need to talk about pornography in schools. Now, don't look at me in a strange way, but not without using the word pornography and without showing pornography, but preparing children that that exists and that is not real and that is not okay and that is not consensual and that's not how people really behave in the real world. Because lovemaking, it's a beautiful thing. And that's about consensual, it's about, you know, mutual respect. And these are the kind of values that we need to instill in young people. But we all agree on that. That is important, and we all agree. But what's also important is to place responsibility on those wonderful platforms who entertain the adult population to ensure that they block those places for adults only. Now, I'm not saying that, we've all seen it, we've all watched pornography perhaps at some point, either accidentally or voluntarily when we were younger than 18. And we shouldn't be ashamed of it, because we're curious. But if we're looking for it, if we want to view it, it's okay. What's not okay is for someone that doesn't want to see it and yet is exposed to it. So placing responsibilities on those platforms who make it available by making multi-million euros every month and becoming richer and richer and then causing these kind of problems, it's not okay. So it's important to, yes, ensure that, we shape policy, we shape regulations, but also we co-create a learning environment which acknowledges that young people do view it, do sext, do text, do expose, do show their bodies. And we need to address these issues because often, when I go into schools, I'm not always very welcome and parents are nervous. But, we need to also measure, now I'm talking to you as an adult, but measure also the language according to the age appropriate of a child. So that's incredibly important. It's also important to create that kind of environment where young people can go to for seeking help, because we have a lot of, sadly, mental issues related to what they've seen. Self-harming seem to have increased amongst children and young people. And often when you go and look what are the problems behind it, you find that either sextortion or sexting or online relationships or porn can be part of all this kind of trouble, young adulthood or younghood, we should say. So providing specialized support is essential. In terms of recommendation for change, I think it's important as well to create that kind of safe space for disclosure. And it's important as well to, as I mentioned, rely on this kind of age verification. Now, it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to resolve everything because children can also find ways to move around age verification and all this. But it's important to balance that together with all the kind of support that we can provide through education as well. It's important to also enhance reporting functions, which often, I've been on a number of social media sites, and that kind of opportunity is not available. And of course, greater information, and that's why you've invited me today, is always welcome. So we are more aware how to, collaborate and how to enhance our knowledge and understanding around this kind of rather complex area of work, which is online harms, grooming, and exploitation. And with that, I think my time is up. Thank you. And can I just say, we're very active on social media. I don't know if you are, but if you wish to learn more about what we do, the types of findings that we disseminate, we are on X now. It's not called Twitter anymore. We have a LinkedIn account, or here's my email address. I'm very happy to continue this conversation outside today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martellozzo. Imamo še nekaj minut, če bi želel kdo postaviti kakšno vprašanje doktorici Martellozzo. We have a question, Dr. Martellozzo. Yes.
I forgot about the question, sorry. Please, do you have any questions?
Yes, of course. I suppose you are familiar with that American experiment where parents agreed to be part of, not part of, but to be around people, police officers who were grooming their children. Parents agreed, and then in the end, it came to meeting from the offender with the child, and they abducted the child, put a black bag on their heads. But in the van where the children were taken, in the end, their parents were sitting in. So reactions were gross from parents hitting their children to mothers being completely disappointed.
I can imagine. No, I wasn't aware of that experiment. It doesn't sound very ethical.
I know.
I think that so that's the difference. There's been a lot of experiments. There's been a lot of, what is it called? Investigative journalists finding themselves, I don't know if it happens in Slovenia, but finding themselves in trouble because they want to investigate and they want to research topics that they shouldn't do because it's either illegal or they don't have any kind of ethical permissions. Now, we as researchers, we will never be allowed to do anything like this. So I always treat those kind of experiments with, I'm not sure if, it's not quite legal or ethical to do that. But it's interesting nonetheless. Any other questions?
Še kakšno vprašanje? Če ni, if not,
no, that was
easy.
Thank you.
Yes. Torej, potem